Hola, this is Senora Hansen, and welcome to my video introducing verbs in Spanish.
Okay, so let's get started. To start with, let's make sure that you understand some basic verb vocabulary in English. A lot of times, things that come up in Spanish that you are taught, there's a lot of assumption that you understand the terms well in English. But let's make sure that you do before we get into how we use verb terms in Spanish. So, there are three terms that I want you to make sure you understand. First, I'll give them to you, and then we'll go into a little bit more depth about each one. So if you don't get them right away, don't worry about it. The first term is verb. Well, a verb is a word that shows action or state of being. The second term you're going to hear is infinitive. Infinitive means the basic form of the verb. And the third word is conjugate. Conjugate means changing the verb into different forms based on the subject. Okay, so let's go back and look at each of these terms in a little more depth. First of all, verbs, what are they? Well, they can be action words like, well, look at this list here. Read, drink, knock, eat, anything that shows action is a verb in English and, of course, in Spanish as well. Now, pay attention because this is important. Every sentence must have a verb. That's true in English, it's true in Spanish. Every sentence must have a verb to be a sentence. And it's easy to think of sentences with action words like, I will drink the water, or the girl writes a paper, or my brother sweeps the floor, or I cooked dinner. In each of those sentences, you can hear an action verb. Every sentence must have a verb. All sentences have verbs, but not all verbs are action words. Some verbs are what we call state of being verbs. And in English, the state of being verb, the main verb, is to be. And here's how we change to be into the forms that we often use it. I am. For example, I am happy. She is. For example, she is tall. It is. It is 3 o'clock. We are. We are friends. All of these are complete sentences, but you notice none of them truly have action. They are using the verb to be in its different forms, and they are still sentences. So, verbs can have action or show action, or they can show a state of being. I am, he is, you are, and you finish that off and you'll have a sentence. The verb to be in English translates into one of two verbs in Spanish. It's either ser or estar. Both of these in Spanish are ways to say to be. And they are ways to, when you change them into their different forms, to say am or are or is and so on. Those are the two ways to do to be in Spanish. In English, we just have one way to do to be. Now, there's a whole bunch we could say about ser and estar, but that's for another video. This video is just to give you an introduction to verbs and to make sure that you're understanding the terminology so that you can use verbs and change them into their right forms in Spanish. Okay, so we've talked about what a verb is. Now we're going to go into our next term that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, infinitive. You're going to see this all the time when you're studying Spanish, and especially when you're talking about verbs. We have infinitives in English too. You use them and you know what they are, but you may not know the word infinitive. So I want to make sure that you understand that, because that's going to help you understand how to use verbs in Spanish. So the infinitive of a verb just means its main or base form. In English, infinitives always have the word to in front of the action or state of being. So to go is the infinitive form of anything to do with go. To run, to talk, to sing, to play, to be. These are all infinitives in English. So anytime you see to in front of an action word or to be, a state of being, that is a verb in English, and that's in its infinitive form. So English verbs in their infinitive form, their base form, are always two words, and it starts with the word to go, to sing, whatever. In Spanish, the infinitive of a verb always ends in the letters AR or ER or IR. So when you see a word in Spanish ending in one of those endings, AR, ER, or IR, you know that it's a verb and that it's in its base form, its infinitive form. So here are some examples of Spanish verbs in their infinitive forms. Some AR verbs. Hablar means to talk. Cantar means to sing. Comer means to eat. Leer, to read. Salir, to leave. Escribir means to write. These are all Spanish verbs. They're all in their infinitive forms, and notice that every time they end in either AR or ER or IR. And what that translates to in English is to, and then the word, the action word, to speak, to read, and so on. Well, now that you know what a verb is, and you know what an infinitive form of the verb is, there's going to be another word you hear a lot when you're learning another language, for example, Spanish, and that is the word conjugate. And conjugate simply means changing the verb into its different forms based on the subject, based on who or what it is you're talking about. So we conjugate in English all the time. And you do that without even thinking about it because it's your first language and you're used to it. So let's look at some examples of conjugating verbs in English. Let's take the verb to run in English. So the infinitive form is to run. But if you want to put that into a sentence, you don't usually use to run. In some cases we do. But usually we change that run so that it fits who's doing the running. So for example, if you're talking about yourself, you say I run. You don't say I too run. You say I run. If you're talking about someone else, you might say she runs. You see what you did to run there? You put an S on the end. That's conjugating the verb. And you probably take no time to think about that in English. You just automatically know how to change a verb to fit the subject. Right? I speak, she speaks. You laugh, they laugh, he laughs. So we change the ending of our verb depending on who's doing the action. And also the tense, like if it's happening in the present or the past or in the future. So for example, to run, I say I run in the present tense, but if I want to put it in the past and say I did it yesterday, I would say I ran. So then I conjugated the verb, putting it into past tense, but also going with the subject I. So conjugating just means changing the verb from its infinitive to the form that goes with the subject and the tense. Okay, so you're going to see a chart that's shaped like this a whole lot in Spanish when you are learning to work with verbs and conjugate verbs. So I'm going to show you how we use the chart a little bit. And I also want you to know that it is super important that you learn your subject pronouns well in Spanish. And those are ones that we studied way back at the beginning. Subject pronouns are the words for I and you and he and she, they, and so on. So I'm going to show you this chart again, and it's filled in this time, and let me break it down for you how it's set up. You see that there's a singular side on the left and a plural side on the right. So when you're talking about one person or animal or thing, it's singular, and more than one is plural. There's also something called first, second, and third person. We have all this in English too. I'm not sure how well you understand that, but when you're talking in the first person, you're talking about yourself. I went to the store, I did this, I that. When you're talking in the second person, you're talking to another person that's with you. And so it's you. You did this, you that, how are you, that kind of thing. And when you're talking in the third person, you're talking about someone else, like he or they, people that may or not be there, but you're talking about someone else. That's third person. So in Spanish, the pronouns that I said are important for you to learn are yo, I, so that's singular, just one, in the first person. Tú, which means you, familiar. Él, ella. Nosotros, which means we, so that would be like I, plural, me plus someone else. Vosotros and ellos. There's also usted, and that goes on the chart as well, but I just want you to get the basic idea of you're going to see this chart, and this chart is going to help you to conjugate verbs, to put the right endings based on whether you're talking about I, yo, or he, él, or they, ellos, or ellas. All of that is going to determine how you end your verb in Spanish to make it fit. Okay, so to wrap it up, in order to use verbs in Spanish, you need to understand the basic terminology. A verb, which is a word that shows action or state of being. Infinitive, which is the basic form of the verb. In English, it would be to in front of the action word or state of being, to be, to write, to sing. In Spanish, the infinitive always ends in AR or ER or IR. And then conjugate is what you do to the infinitive to change it, to make it so that it fits with the subject. And remember, review those subject pronouns. I, which is yo, you, which is tú, and so on, so that you are really ready to start using those to help you to change verbs into the correct forms so that you'll be speaking Spanish. Adios.